Thanks for joining us today for Grinds on a Dime, an online cooking series with affordable, easy recipes to feed your family. I'm Marielle Hampton, and my colleague is Hallie Cristobal. We're both extension agents with the University of Hawaii's College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, or CTAHR. As part of the Cooperative Extension Service, we provide science-based public outreach and education to support families, youth, older adults, and residents across the lifespan in Hawaii. All right, before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. You'll see an anonymous poll pop up on your screen. If you could just fill that out, that would be great. We are required to do this poll for federal reporting purposes. The next thing to keep in mind is that this is a webinar, so you can't speak aloud, but if you do have any questions or comments, please type those in the chat so one of us can read it to whoever's presenting. We love having input from you guys. It makes it a lot more fun and dynamic, and we always like answering your questions. It usually brings us into cool new realms that we wouldn't otherwise think to explore. And of course, food safety check-in. Please wash your hands with soap and water for 20 seconds before working with food or eating, especially if you do something like leave to go use the bathroom or give your dog a pat or anything like that. Make sure you're always washing your hands with soap and water for 20 seconds before going back to touch that food. Today's recipes, we are going to be doing a turkey pot pie, ham and bean soup, and cranberry meatball sliders with coleslaw. So hopefully these recipes can help you use up some of the leftovers that you have hanging around your kitchen. Leftovers should usually be eaten 3 to 4 days after they are cooked, unless you store them in your freezer. So today is probably the last day you should be eating those Thanksgiving leftovers. In order to avoid wasting food, you can transform them into something new. The other thing to keep in mind about these recipes is that the ingredients are probably on sale at your local store. Even if you don't have something like turkey or ham, those should be pretty affordable right now after the holiday. So I'm going to turn it over to Hallie Cristobal, who will be cooking our first recipe, turkey pot pie. And then we will finish up with me cooking some ham and bean soup and those cranberry meatball sliders.
All right, thanks, Marielle. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and start our leftover turkey pot pie. So usually I make this every year. I always, if you were here earlier, we do a lot of food for Thanksgiving and we do a lot of food for Christmas and Easter and everything. Our family usually has a big imu, and so we usually have a lot of food just in general. But we like to also freeze a lot of food. So because we freeze a lot of food, we like to make extra. Then we can have it all year long, just like, you know, if we want to have kalua and cabbage, we usually will roast some pork butts. If we will do some whole chicken sometimes, just so that we can have it. So I'm going to go ahead and put my butter into my saucepan. And it's just a few tablespoons of butter to get it going. And the reason we need the butter is because we're going to be making a roux. So if you were here a couple classes ago, Marielle talked about a roux. So what a roux is a basic fat and flour mixture that thickens sauces. So today we're going to be using butter and flour. You could use oil and flour. You could use margarine. You could pretty much use anything. So to this, we're going to be adding in some of our veggies. We have our onions, our celery, and our carrots. So I had fresh carrots in my fridge today. So I am using fresh. On the recipe, it said frozen. But if you are using frozen, you can just go ahead and make sure it's defrosted and it'll work just the same. So we're going to saute these all together. And this is just going to be our base, or another word for it is our mirepoix, which is usually a celery, carrot, and onion mixture that people add into soups or stews. just to get everything going. So we're gonna let that start to come to saute. We're also gonna add in some salt. And again, if you weren't here the last class, this is an electric salt shaker or grinder from Amazon. So if you are, you know, a little bit older, if you have some kids that you want to get into cooking, it's just a good little toy. All right, get this going. And I also preheated my oven to 400 degrees. So while this is cooking, we can go ahead and talk about our pie crust. So my store didn't have the rollout pie crusts. So I just found these in the freezer section. So they're pre-made and they're already molded to a 9-inch pan. However, these do not come with lids or tops. So what I'm doing, because I didn't have any at the store, and you are more than welcome to make your own, completely fine, is I just found some puff pastry and I've just been letting it sit out for a while just so that it's more pliable, that I can add it onto my pie crust after I fill them. So that's what I'm doing. But again, if you have the rollout ones at your store, feel free to use that. I know that a lot of people have those during the holidays in their house because they're making pies or things like that. So the store may be out. So that's just a few little alternatives. Another thing you can do is just not top it. Like if you can just find the pie crust in the freezer section. And it's actually a really cheap find because you can get these 2 deep dish pie crusts. 2 of them actually came out to only $3 for the whole set. So that was really cheap find. All right, this is cooking down nicely. I'm just gonna give this a few minutes.
I'm glad you taught us about the word mirepoix.
So how many of you ate something new on Thanksgiving that you never tried before, or maybe you thought you didn't like, or somebody brought something to your Thanksgiving that was very interesting and you tried it? And even if you didn't like it, how about you guys put it in the chat and we can kind of name some things off? That's pretty cool. So we're gonna go let this go for maybe another minute or so. Those pies do not need to be defrosted completely. You can actually throw them in the oven frozen. They'll just have to go a few minutes or so. If you are, so these, if you're using them as like an actual pie, like a cold pie, you would have to pre-bake them. But since we're putting this pie filling and everything into the oven, you do not need to pre-bake them. All right, to this, I'm gonna add in my flour. So I've got about 2/3 of a cup, or it should just kind of cover your veggies. All right, and then now we want to make sure that we're stirring this all, combining it. We want to let our flour cook just a little bit so that we don't get that dry flour taste. So you want to make sure you're mixing that all with the butter and the juices that were released from those vegetables. And you'll see it'll kind of start to brown just a little bit. It'll thicken up. The veggies will start to stick to that cooked flour, which is really good. And this is how you're gonna create, it's called like a vegetable roux. So what it does is it sticks to the vegetables so that when you add in your liquid, everything kind of just molds together. That flour will start to come off of those veggies and you'll create a nice thick roux. All right, so this, I'm gonna add in my water, which is supposed to be my chicken broth, but I have better than bouillon. So I'm going to be adding in my chicken stock separately. Stir that. And as you can kind of see, now that we've added that liquid, our sauce is starting to come off. It's going to thicken a lot more. To this, we're also going to be adding in our milk. So about 1.5 cups or so milk. And if you have half and half, like I have half and half today, because I live in a small town, and when we have holidays, a lot of our things on the shelves just go so quickly. Our milk was empty, our pie crusts were empty. So today I'm using half and half, which is completely fine. As you can kind of see, it's starting to thicken up real nice. I'm gonna go ahead and add in my Italian seasoning. Just a little bit. And then to this, I'm also gonna do a little variation, and I'm going to add in a little bit of celery salt and a little bit of rosemary, but you do not need to add this in. I just like mine a little herbier, which is not a word, sorry, herbier. But I like to add that in. All right. Okay, to this, I'm gonna add in my turkey. And this is my emu turkey that we had. It was just shredded up. So I'm gonna go ahead and add that in. And at this step is where you kind of determine, okay, does it need more liquid? Does it need, does it need to be thicker? Should I leave it the way it is? So for me, because I have a few more ingredients to add, I'm just gonna add in a little bit more milk, or half and half. And because I added in half and half instead of milk, my mixture is gonna be a little thicker than usual, which is completely fine. All right. I'm gonna add in some of my peas. And if you've seen the previous shows, I like to add in frozen vegetables. So I've got some peas and some frozen green beans. And this is just another good way to get your vegetable servings in for the day with something that's hearty, something that'll keep you full, something that can feed a whole family. All right, I'm just gonna add in a little bit more just to thin it out just a little bit. And I'm also gonna add in just a little more salt and pepper. All right, we're almost ready. So I'm just gonna make sure everything is combined, all my salt, pepper, seasonings, frozen veggies, cooked veggies, turkey, my sauce, everything is combined. And it doesn't have to be boiling hot. It doesn't have to be cooked all the way through. Your veggies don't have to be mushy because we are gonna bake it again. All right. Perfect. I'm gonna turn that off, and I'm going to grab one of my pie pans. Okay, and I'm just going to take some of my filling and put that right into my pie pan. And this should fill 2 pie pans and maybe have a little extra, depending on how full you want it. I'll do one more. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and take our puff pastry, which I've let defrost. And it comes in like this sheet that looks like this, if you guys can see. So what I'm going to do is I'm just gonna lay that right on top. And then you do not have to do it this way. You can crimp the edges, but the easier way is to just cut away the edges. So you would follow the edge of your pan. And if you have a regular pie crust, you would not need to do this part. because it should come out as a circle already. Okay, and then I like it a little rustic, so I just like to crimp it just a little bit on the edges that are hanging over, just so that we don't have a huge mess. And remember, we're still learning. We don't want everything to look perfect and be perfect. That's what learning is all about. Okay, so I'm just gonna put a few little nicks in here. And then I am going to take this and put this into my oven. And it'll probably take about a half hour to about 35 minutes or so. So we are actually gonna go ahead and let Marielle do her section, and then I will show you this when it is done. But here it is. And look, it came together in what, like 15 minutes almost? Perfect.
That looks great, Haley. I have to say, I've never made a pie or anything like that, but you make that look pretty manageable.
All right, I'm gonna put this in the oven, and then you can go ahead and spotlight yours.
All right, let's move on to our next recipe. So I'm gonna start out by making a ham and beans soup to use up your leftover ham. And then we're going to move on to do some cranberry meatball sliders with coleslaw. So we're gonna start with our soup. So I'm just going to turn on my stove and we're going to heat up some oil in there. So I'm going to use today, just I am trying to cut down on my oil a little bit. So once your oil's hot, we're going to be doing our own version of the Mirepoix that Haley was talking about, which is that mix of onions and carrots that typically makes the base for kind of French style cooking. So we just have one diced onion, just a white onion, and also 3 carrots that have been diced pretty small. This soup actually comes together in about 20 minutes. It only cooks for about 10 to 15 minutes. So we want to make sure that those carrots are small enough that they will get cooked in the short amount of time it takes to put this together. All right, giving that a stir. So basically we're just going to cook this for long enough. Oh, not sure if it looks a little frozen. Hang on. Okay. We're going to be cooking these just for long enough that the onions become translucent and soft. And then once those are ready, we're going to be adding in some garlic and thyme leaves. I have here about 4 cloves of minced garlic. And we're not adding them in yet because we want to make sure they don't get burned. So that's why we're going to cook these onions and carrots first. We'll also be adding in about a tablespoon of fresh thyme. If you don't have fresh, you could also substitute with dried. I think in general they say 1/3 or 1/4 of the amount you would do fresh. So definitely not a full tablespoon if you're doing dried, maybe 1/4 tablespoon or 1/2 tablespoon of dried thyme. What I like to do with my fresh thyme is just kind of use the stems to tie it in a little bundle, and then I let it cook in the soup or the stew that I'm making. And then I kind of pull it out at the end, and usually by that time, all of the leaves have kind of cooked off of it, and you're just left with a bundle of stems that are easy to pull out. All right, I'm gonna add a little bit more oil. All right, that's just gonna need a couple more minutes. So after we add that garlic and thyme, the next thing we're gonna be doing is adding pretty much all the rest of our ingredients. So we're going to be doing 3 cans of white beans. And the interesting thing about this recipe is we're not going to drain and rinse them, which is what we usually do with our beans. And that's because we usually are trying to get out any extra salt, as well as starch. For example, when we're making that tuna couscous salad where we want those nice kidney beans, we don't want them in any kind of like gummy juices or anything like that. So that's why we drain and rinse them for those kind of recipes. For this, I'm using the juices from the beans to kind of add some thickness and body and starch to the soup. So that's why you'll see in the recipe we're calling for either no salt added or low sodium beans. Now those might be a little more expensive. I had to get organic to get that. So it's up to you. What we're really trying to do here is limit the amount of salt that's in this dish because you're going to be getting a lot of salt from the ham that you're using. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and add in my minced garlic and my thyme. Give that a stir. And now I'm going to go ahead and add my 3 cans of white beans and their juices. So as I mentioned, having the juices of the beans in this soup is kind of like a shortcut to getting some of that thickness that you'd get from a soup that you cook for a longer period of time. So that's why we're going to do it that way. So the next thing I'm going to add is 3 cups of chicken stock. Of course, you can always use better than bouillon or something like that, but I chose to use unsalted chicken stock for the same reason as I use the no salt added beans, because I know there's going to be a lot of salt in this already. Okay, we're going to add in a couple of bay leaves just for a little more flavor. Give that a stir. I use cans of navy beans, but you can use any kind of white beans. Cannellini works fine. I've done it with cannellini beans, which are kind of like white kidney beans. You could also do with kidney beans. I think that would be fine. I've done a mix of cannellini and kidney beans and it tasted great. And the final ingredient, we're going to be adding about 3 cups of diced cooked ham. So hopefully you have this left over. If you don't, what I did was I bought ham steak from the store. It was about 2 pounds of ham steak, and I diced it up and cut off the extra fat. And that's going to work fine for us here. You could add in a smoked ham hock if you have leftover smoked ham hock. There's a lot of other things you could add if you have a little more time to cook it. You could do diced potatoes, are kind of a classic ingredient in ham soup. You could also do sweet potatoes or pumpkin. Those are just going to increase your cooking time, probably by 10-15 minutes at least. Another option here, if you like your soup to be really creamy, is rather than putting all of your beans straight in, you could reserve some of them and mash them up a little bit so they kind of turn creamy and add those in. Something I also did the other day was I added some instant mashed potatoes to add some thickness to it. So if you do happen to have a scoop of leftover mashed potatoes you want to throw in here, that would be fine as well. All right. So this is going to come to a simmer, and then we're just going to let it cook for about 10 or 15 minutes, and that's all it needs. So I'm just going to set that aside to simmer while we move on to our cranberry meatball sliders with coleslaw. What would you substitute for the ham in this? That's plant-based. The smoky flavor is something that you're not going to be able to replicate super easily with plant-based foods, but you can always add a few drops of liquid smoke to do that. So perhaps maybe if you did really firm seasoned tofu that had a bunch of flavor in it, you could do that plus a couple drops of liquid smoke. I don't know, Haley, do you have any suggestions for a plant-based option to substitute for the ham?
I know, like for us, when we are trying to, I don't know if on the Big Island you guys have something that's called Portuguese bean soup. Do you guys have that? Yeah, so when we make a healthier version, we actually use soy rizo. So it's actually a soy-based chorizo, and it is so good. It is a little bit spicier, but it does have that nice smoky flavor that like ham would give you. And it also kind of turns into almost like a hamburger texture in there. So it's not quite like regular ham, but it is a really good vegan or vegetarian substitute.
That's a great suggestion. Back when I was vegan, I loved soy rizo was probably my favorite like plant-based meat substitute because I love that like smokiness and the flavor of that if you can get it. Or perhaps another kind of plant-based sausage substitute would potentially work if you can find that. But then you probably could find things like seasoning mixes that you could use to marinate your tofu or tempeh or something like that to give it some flavors that might work as well. So we'll do a little research and get back to you on that. So I'm going to start by making some coleslaw to go with our cranberry meatball sliders. So what I have here, just as a little shortcut, is this one is a 12-ounce package of coleslaw mix. This is absolutely a shortcut. It turns a coleslaw process into literally 5 minutes, but you can definitely save a few dollars by shredding your own cabbage and carrots to make the base of your coleslaw. This was about $5 for this bag. So that's what we're going to be using. We're going to start by making our dressing. I have here half a cup of mayonnaise. You could use a plant-based mayonnaise if you don't eat eggs. But that's going to be pretty much the basis for the coleslaw. And then there are a lot of variations here, but the basics are some kind of mayonnaise or mayonnaise substitute. I have here 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar that I'm going to add, but you could also use a lot of different kinds of vinegar instead of apple cider vinegar. You could do white vinegar, champagne vinegar, white wine vinegar, that sort of thing. And then pretty much salt and pepper. So I'm gonna do about a 1/4 teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper. You could do more or less depending on how much you like pepper. And then we're going to do a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. A lot of recipes out there call for sugar or some kind of sweetener. Personally, I don't think it really needs it. There's enough sweetness in the cabbage and the carrots. I don't really prefer my coleslaw to be sweet. I think it's unnecessary and it adds unnecessary calories. So I don't put any sweetener in my mix. So I'm just going to go ahead and whip that up to make our dressing.
And also, just adding in, if you do like a sweeter coleslaw, you could use rice vinegar instead, like a seasoned rice vinegar, and it would kind of give a little bit sweeter without having a lot of sugar in it. And also, if we have anybody here from Kauai, that coleslaw packet, you can find it at Safeway on $5 Fridays for 2 packs for $5. So that's a really good saver. And then there was something else I was going to add, but I can't remember. But yeah, rice vinegar would be a good substitute if you like a little bit sweeter.
Thanks. Yeah. And of course, you can use like a little dab of honey or maple syrup if you like natural sweeteners. But also, since we're eating this coleslaw with these cranberry meatball sliders, they're already going to be pretty sweet. So I would choose something that's a little more savory to go with that. So the thing about coleslaw that I have found is it's easy to add too much dressing, because as soon as you mix this cabbage with it, it's kind of like making coleslaw, where they're going to start letting off a bunch of moisture. And so you don't necessarily need, you don't want to make it too watery at the beginning. So what I'm going to do is just add about half of my dressing, and then I'm going to go ahead and mix that in and see how I feel about it. You can always add more dressing later. The thing about coleslaw is ideally you want to refrigerate it for at least a couple of hours before you eat it, to give it a chance to have that cabbage soften and absorb that dressing.
Another tip too, if you're in a pinch and you're kind of worried about adding too much dressing, is you can also just sprinkle a little, like very little bit of salt, and the cabbage will actually start to soften and release that liquid. Then you can go ahead and pat dry it or squeeze it a little bit, and then add in a little bit of dressing, and it'll actually absorb that dressing without making things really watery.
That's a great tip. Thanks, Haley. I'm new to making coleslaw, but now that I've made it once and I see how simple it is, it's literally like 3 ingredients for the dressing and pretty much cabbage and carrots to make the base of it. I think I'm gonna try making it more. It's really a nice side for a lot of different dishes. All right, so we got that mixed up there. I'm gonna give it a taste. I think I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm gonna let that soak in. Ideally, I'd be sticking this in the fridge for a couple of hours. Let's see how our soup is doing. Simmering away here. We have a little more time to go, I think. Give it a stir. And we'll get ready to put together our cranberry meatball sliders. So, I don't know, those of you who are with us today, I did not know that you could just buy a package of fully cooked meatballs at the grocery store. So that was something that I learned. So this is a great way to use up if you have leftover cranberry sauce, or if you're like me and you end up with just a jar or a can of cranberry sauce sitting in your pantry for so long and you're like, what am I going to use this for? Well, this recipe can use that up. So basically, you're going to buy a bag of pre-cooked meatballs and follow the package directions to prepare those. My bag just said to cook them in a sauce until they were heated through. So I just went ahead and microwaved these for a few minutes to get them defrosted so they're ready. We're going to be making a sauce for them that is just a cup of ketchup, a can of jellied cranberry sauce, 1 tablespoon of lemon juice, and then 3 tablespoons of brown sugar. So as I mentioned, it's going to be a pretty sweet dish, but basically we're going to just put together our sauce, toss the meatballs in the sauce and heat it all up. And that's pretty much it. You slap them on a slider roll, serve it with some coleslaw. So I'm gonna go ahead and serve up my soup so we can free up our stove here. So you can see how it's looking kind of creamy already from adding the juices of those beans. So just gonna go ahead and take a little shortcut. Those of you cooking at home, you may wanna let your soup simmer for a little bit longer. But here we go. And then I am going to top it with just a little bit of shredded parsley, which I happen to have left over from last week. So, like I said, love always putting some fresh herbs on top of all of my dishes. And if you have them in your garden, that's great, but also Like this parsley I chopped up for our lesson a week ago and it's still looking super fresh. So as long as you prep them and store them properly, you can have fresh herbs for a long time. There you go, some ham and bean soup. That's just about one of the quickest soups that I have ever made. All right, any questions while I get us ready for our sliders?
Yeah, and if you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and put it in the chat and then we will read it off. Or I can answer them for you as well if you had any other questions that may not be related to Thanksgiving or cooking on these kinds of recipes, or if you guys just have questions in general.
Yeah, Haley is so great at answering questions. So,
Thanks.
I've got my pot heating up here. I'm going to go ahead and add my cup of ketchup. It's also a great way to use up if you have some ketchup that you're not crazy about. You can do that. Now there's so many variations to these sliders. You can add so many different kinds of spices, but one of the great variations that I've seen is using barbecue sauce instead of ketchup. If you prefer things a bit more spicy and zingy, or what am I trying to say? Zesty. All right, just gonna whisk this up while it heats up. We're pretty much just trying to get this to a smooth consistency before we add in our meatballs. All right, 2 more ingredients. Tablespoon of lemon juice. And 3 tablespoons of brown sugar. So this is a sweet one. All right. That was pretty quick, huh? We're ready to toss in our meatballs. So as I said, I just microwave these for a few minutes first. It was just a bit of a shortcut. Otherwise, it kind of, if you put them into the sauce frozen, it's going to take a bit of time for them to get heated through to the center. So this way, we just have to cook them in this sauce for a couple of minutes and we're pretty much ready to go. So these are, you know, something you can do with your family, but they also make great appetizers. I've had meatballs served with just a toothpick that went so fast at a family party. They're not the healthiest, but they're really addictive, I'll tell you that. These are 100% pork meatballs. I just got the home style Johnsonville, I believe, bag of meatballs. I think it cost about $10 for these meatballs, which is about 24 meatballs. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get ready to serve. As you can see, this is already bubbling away, heating up those meatballs. So. I'm gonna go ahead and you can either, you know, you could serve these with potato salad or mac salad would be good. But if you're gonna serve it with coleslaw, you could either put the coleslaw on the side or personally, I'm going to actually put mine on the sliders. I think it adds really nice crunch and sort of fresh veggie kind of flavor to the richness and sweetness that we're getting from these meatballs.
Hey, Rose, I see that you raised your hand. If you have a question, you can go ahead and put it in the chat and I can read it out for you.
All right. Plating these boys up. Surprisingly pretty for such a sort of fast throw together meal with so few elements to it. Just gonna put a little bit of sauce on each of them. and then I'll serve those right away. So you can either serve them open faced like that, or if you have toothpicks, you could stick a toothpick through the top of each of these. If you happen to have some rosemary growing in your yard, you could also take some sprigs of rosemary and use those as toothpicks to stick them through the top and hold it together. All right, there you go. Some really fast cranberry meatball sliders with coleslaw to use up that leftover cranberry sauce, and some ham and bean soup. A really quick way to use up that leftover ham.
Unfortunately, mine's still in the oven, but I can show you guys what it looks like in the oven. Let's see if this actually works. So there they are. There. I don't know if you guys can see them, but they're fluffing up nice. Or maybe let me see if I can open this. There we go. So they'll probably be done in another 10, 15 minutes or so.